Well, when it comes to Calvinism, it seems like looking back now over the last 36 months with feedback and collaboration, it appears it has fatal flaws. That is, it's just the fallible elements are such that it really can't be repaired, but there are advocates, supporters of the fallible construct. In an interview with a young man, he was in a high-tech profession, very well-educated, had demonstrated critical thinking skills. He was an advocate of Calvinism, and I certainly didn't begrudge him for that. It's a very pragmatic, very easy to learn, has an acronym, TULIP. It all fits the 5 points. And so as far as a religious, philosophical construct, it's very portable. You can move on. So I asked if he were aware. I asked him directly. I said, are you aware of any fallible elements in it? He said, well, I'm certain it's fallible, has fallible elements. He agreed with that. But of those, he was not aware. I said, well, that's called source bias. He said, what do you mean? I said, well, none of us really have any interest in what doesn't support that which we favor or prefer, as the Bible uses the word heresy for preference. Now, of course, there's damnable heresies. That's another category altogether, in which you find denial of the resurrection, deny Jesus came in the flesh, deny justification out from the faith of Christ. That would be considered damnable heresies. But as far as the preferences, I began to talk with him about the forensics, and he agreed reluctantly. And I certainly don't expect any of us, myself included, especially as a pastor of a church, we have people come to us from where they originated. Some originated from religious identities of Catholic, Protestant, Judaic, Islamic, occultic, New Age, or some type of denomination. So it's like political identity. Some people call themselves a Republican or a Democrat or an independent or whatever else is out there. However, it doesn't indicate much anymore. That is, social issues are now have crossed party lines. So you can have someone qualify themselves as a Republican. They say they're fiscally Republican, but socially liberal, whatever all that is. So there's all these combinations. Similar to Calvinism, there's hyper, then there's Calvinism, and there's a partial point Calvinism. I guess if you're 2 points, you're 40% Calvinist. So then there's Calvinians, where they try to blend these things. So anyway, as the conversation continued, he was not aware that in the biblical Hebrew, no occurrence of God as the subject, believe as the verb, where God causes faith. The Bible, as I explained to him, in the causative stems of the biblical Hebrew, said Abraham caused himself to believe, Genesis 15:6. He wasn't aware of that. He wasn't aware in the New Testament where believe as a verb and then believing as a gerundive noun referring to a person. And I told him that the assertion that regeneration precedes faith first was nowhere in the Bible. That's a measurable, quantifiable, provable, and falsifiable assertion. And it's been proven to be false. He was somewhat disconcerted, but because of his aptitude, he had his own skill, his own job, his own education, his own training. He didn't have the investment, so he didn't, as we say, move into the emotive side of his mind or leave his mind and begin to argue and banter with some kind of irrational outburst. Because he really wasn't, he had no, as we say, he had no investment. He still preferred Calvinism, and he said he did not know that the predestination, election, those were discussed in church letters. So he was unaware that the Bible teaches man is causal. So free will, as far as libertarian or compatibilism, were just more abstract constructs or concepts that remove that layer away. And the Bible asserts he was not aware of living theism, I told him, I said, well, movies are out there called God is Not Dead, so why is your theism dead? But again, I enjoyed the dialogue only because when someone doesn't have a vested interest in the, if you will, challenge to their construct, and his critical thinking stabilized him for the conversation. And he had no livelihood at risk. So if you ever want to know, it's a good advice as a man on the radio, YouTube, famous Presbyterian named Steve Brown. He said, you'll never win an argument with someone who has a vested interest in not losing. Well, even he is biased according to his own, as you say, appropriation of Calvinism. He was primed according to it. Now he preaches as though God's living, as though Jesus has been raised from the dead, as though Holy Spirit is here accompanying him. But it was quite remarkable that these fatal flaws, such as man's causation, man does cause faith, and recently an article, an Albert Mohler said that Arminians believe that faith is a product of free will. Now, let's just stop there. He used the word Arminian. He used free will without defining it. But the truth is, he would never teach. The biblical Hebrew teaches that man causes faith. Abram caused faith. Abram caused himself to believe. He would never teach John 20:31 that these attesting miracles and their contextualized narratives have been written and remain on record in order that you might deliberately believe, cause yourself to believe that Jesus is the Christ. And as one who is believing now, that is what occurs when you're born again, you are a believing one. And he was aware, continued the conversation. The young man was aware of 1 John 5:1. He knew of James White, had heard of him. He's probably the world's leading apologist who defends Reformed theology. And he does an excellent job as far as scholarship. And I told him, I said, well, to place new birth or regeneration prior to the finite verb to believe does not exist in the Bible. That the Bible clearly states that everyone who is believing, that's a gerundive noun, so believers are the ones fathered out from God. So I even told him we were graced to keep on believing, Philippians 1:29, but it didn't say graced to then initially believe, and that was interesting. So he was unaware of that causation in the Bible. He was unaware that the definition of free will according to libertarian compatibilism is foreign to the Bible. He was unaware that predestination and election are discussed in church letters. But he was well receptive as far as able to listen and respond. It was only toward the end of the conversation that he began to be a little bit incited. And what provoked him was I said, well, how is it that you're so comfortable handing off or extending this fallible construct to others without taking responsibility for the fallible elements that you're transferring as a virus, if you will, that among this construct are these errors and these fallible elements. And then he began to be somewhat emotive, disappointingly so, because I didn't expect it. What I assumed was happening was he was engaged in a logical conversation, but the entire time, apparently his experiences and banter and argumentation had never found him facing someone who could demonstrate so easily from the Bible absolute fatal flaws in the construct, fallible religious philosophy called Calvinism. And he began to say, who do you think you are? Which he used the thinking word. He said, I was speaking over his head, which was impossible, but that's how he emoted. He began to say things that weren't even rational. How is causation over his head when he's in a technical field that requires the expertise and training that's seldom afforded many, and those that have the opportunity, even fewer can pass the test exams or meet the mental requirements to successfully accomplish a body of work and graduate. So I listened, and disappointed, I still was careful to listen to him, that is, listen to his feedback. And when he said I was talking over his head, I was using technical words and jargon, that's when I had to be careful not to embarrass him, because had I retorted and just said, well, look at the expertise required in your field, look at the technical language, look at the critical thinking involved. But he began then to decompose, and I began to wrap it up, because I knew I had informed him of enough that he knew that whatever he had once thought Calvinism was, I think he had the illusion that it was infallible, and that somehow it was enough to say closed theism. And again, I said, well, what about living theism? And as I said to him, why do we have movies about God's not dead, but our theism is? Why do we have movies, God's not dead, but our constructs are? Why do we have the affirmation that the scriptures are infallible, but everything we seem to do appears to be using the infallible to support the fallible? So living theism had not occurred to him, even though 52 times in the English Bible that phrase appears. So the attribute of living is very significant in the Bible. He was unaware of causation, the fallacy of asserting free will and then defining it by an abstraction such as libertarian or compatibilism of philosophy. He was unaware of the church letters. He was unaware of the difference of a finite verb and a participle. He was unaware that regeneration does not precede the verb or the act to believe. So it was very much an overload for him, a cognitive overload, but it was also too much, I say it was too highly concentrated of a dispelling of his illusions that Calvinism was infallible. And I just told him finally, but for want of a text, Calvinism's not bad as far as a religious construct, but it is not a determinant whether or not someone believes the gospel. Calvinists compromise with other gospels. They ally themselves with people who renounce justification out from faith, the faith of Christ, the faithfulness of Christ. And he had no answer for that, nor was I being an inquisitor. I just simply was making sure he knew that nothing about Calvinism immunizes someone. He had never even considered what's the purpose for which someone's chosen in election. He was just interested in affirming that somehow God picked someone who went to heaven or picked someone who went to hell, as if that aim and objective accomplished anything in this life for which a person is chosen. He had no interest in what a church is, nor baptism, nor fellowship into the gospel, nor to whom was the Great Commission given. So with all that in mind, those are the 5 fatal flaws of Calvinism. And I enjoyed the interview because it was a divine appointment. I certainly give God the glory for that moment that I could speak to him. So you have a blessed day, and review this and take the time to go through the scriptures and listen carefully. So you have a blessed day.